The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees, assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, usefulness of the information presented on our site. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now I'm going to turn over the introduction of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the Program Coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Kelly, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to share with you a couple of things that we are particularly excited about. First, I want to let you know that our website is now mobile-friendly and accessible on any smartphone. Next, I'd like to draw your attention to the slide on your screen. On November 3rd in Mendham, New Jersey, we are holding our third annual Walk for TS. For those of you in and around New Jersey, please join us on the 3rd. Form a team and walk or run with us. We also need volunteers to help with the lead up to the event as well as the day of. If you can't join us that day, please log on to our website and make a donation in support of the services we offer, such as tonight's webinar on educational rights for your child. Now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce tonight's presenter, Sue Connors. This is Sue's third appearance on our Wednesday webinar schedule this year. Last Wednesday, she spoke on 504s and IEPs and the differences between the two. Earlier this year in April, she presented on tips for TS in the classroom. Both of those webinars are available for free download on our website. Sue's presentation tonight is the second half of an educational series she started last Wednesday, in which she will discuss disciplining a child with neurological issues, as well as what options a parent has when educational services for their child are denied. The New Jersey Center for Tourette has known Sue for many years. She has had a long career in education and advocacy, working with children and families living with Tourette syndrome. Sue, now a retired middle school teacher from upstate New York, has more than 33 years of classroom experience. She served many years on the board of directors for the National Tourette Syndrome Association and was founder and chair of their education committee. While at National TSA, she worked as their education specialist. In that capacity, she traveled extensively in the U.S. and Puerto Rico, as well as other countries around the world, consulting and presenting workshops on TS. Sue has won numerous local, state, and national awards for her work in the TS field. She has consulted with and made appearances on a number of television programs featuring information about Tourette. She's published numerous articles, brochures, videos, and book chapters on the education of children with Tourette, and recently published her first book entitled The Tourette Syndrome and OCD Checklist, a practical reference for parents and educators. When it comes to information and discussion about Tourette, Sue knows what she's talking about because she has Tourette herself, as do other members of her family. Sue, welcome. We're delighted to have you back, and without further introduction, I'll turn tonight's presentation over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's nice to be back. I'm welcome back those who were with us last week, and the many of you who emailed me afterward to get some of the information that I had suggested. I hope I got back to everyone. I did my best. Tonight's discussion is going to be continuing on the same lines of educational rights, but we're discussing, as opposed to last week, we were discussing, how to obtain services, what services are available. Tonight we're going to talk about what happens when services are denied, and that does happen, as many of us know, and also an issue that I feel is pretty critical with a lot of the kids that I work with across, in my chapter, but also across the country, and that is the disciplining of a child with Tourette syndrome, the misunderstanding of Tourette symptoms of some of the associated disorders, and an actual behavior problem. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that and what kind of things are available, what your rights are, etc. I'm going to start with something I actually talked about last week because there are different things that we can not agree with when we're working with school systems. And One of them is evaluations. And so for those of you who were with us last week, this is a repeat, but you know, there are times when we have requested certain evaluations from the school. We go into the school and they go through the evaluations, and you just don't agree with what the evaluations are saying. You know, for example, you may request an occupational therapy evaluation, and you know that your child is really struggling with handwriting issues. In a lot of ways, note-taking is really difficult, and an OT, an occupational therapist, evaluates them and says that they are in the average range, and where you're seeing a lot of struggles. Sometimes it's a matter of the occupational therapist just not giving them a long enough writing sample. There are a lot of different factors that could come into that. So anyway, with any evaluation, if you don't agree to it, if you don't agree with it, excuse me, as a parent, you have the right to respectfully disagree, and by doing so, you know, you have the right to an independent educational evaluation at public expense. That means the expense of the school system, you know, and as you know, in addition to what they've already done. Now, I know that sounds like kind of a crazy rule, a crazy law, and I've got the it's part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and I've got the number on the screen, so when you go in, you can actually refer to the part of the IDEA that quotes this. I've often wondered how the government has ever allowed this to go through, but it's been there for years, so we take full advantage of it. And what that is, if you get the results of an evaluation, whether it be the school psychologist evaluation, whether it be the occupational therapy evaluation, the speech language for auditory processing, and you don't agree with it, you just have to simply write a letter to the school, very respectfully disagreeing with their findings, and the school then has to, you have the right, the school district has to pay for an outside evaluation outside the school district. So it's a you know, kind of a nice thing to use, because it means that what the school district, you know, their evaluation isn't always the end all and be all. There are people, you know, especially with some of our kids who have, you know, very complicated disorders. It's not just Tourette, maybe ADHD. They've got a lot of other things going on, and sometimes it needs an outside neuropsychological evaluation as opposed to what the school district is giving, which is just a psychological evaluation. So anyway, I'll start with that, although it's a repeat from last week. The next thing we're going to talk about is what happens if I don't agree with the decision that the committee has made. You go in and you're asking for a 504 accommodation plan, or you're asking for an IEP, and what happens if they don't agree with that decision? I mean, they don't give you what you want. You basically have two choices. Your first choice is called due process. And due process basically protects the rights of parents to have input into their educational program, to take steps to resolve disagreements when parents and school districts disagree with one another. You're asking for an impartial hearing before an impartial, you know, third party to resolve the issue. And we're going to talk in a minute about what that entails. There's also another process called mediation, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, mediation, for many parents, they would rather start with mediation to see if they can resolve something on that level. And basically what mediation is a meeting between the parents and the school district with an impartial person called a mediator. And it doesn't necessarily have to be someone appointed by the state education department. It could be someone from a local educational agency, but it's not someone connected with the school per se. That's the important part. So there will be a meeting between parents and the school district with an impartial person called a mediator who will help both sides come to an agreement that each finds acceptable. I've gone to some of these hearings with mediators, and they can be, you know, it kind of, their intention is to bring it back to a, you know, a level that's not so, fighting each other. It's not a battle that's going on, and they help kind of come up with some ideas of what we can do to resolve it. And it sometimes works quite well, which is nice. Now, if that doesn't work, then we have to go to an impartial due process hearing, which is a meeting between parents and the school district. Now, at that meeting, each side presents its position, and the hearing officer makes the decision. He's not there to mediate. He is actually more in the role of a judge that a judge would be at a court hearing. He decides what the appropriate educational program is based on whatever was presented to him and the requirements in law. School districts must give parents a written copy of special education procedural safeguards. This document outlines the steps for due process hearings and mediation. That's something they must give them at the IEP meeting, and certainly when the parents disagree with what the results of that meeting are. Parents, I'm sorry, I just repeated that. Parents must be given a copy when their child is first referred and every time they are notified of an IEP meeting for their child. Now, I have to tell you, due process hearing is a legal process. It may be lengthy. I've seen some due process hearings from the time you request them until they're actually resolved. The hearing officer is appointed from the State Ed Department, and the hearing actually takes place and is resolved. I've seen them go on for, literally months, which is very discouraging when you have a child that you feel is not getting services, and that child is, having to continue on in school and not be failing and not doing well and having social emotional issues, whatever, but you're waiting for this whole process to take place. A lawyer for a due process hearing is highly recommended. They will have a lawyer. The school district will have a lawyer who will be conducting their part of the hearing. And it is important that I think the parents have one also. I've seen some take place with just an educational advocate, and they've gone fairly well. But you have to know that the school district will be bringing a lawyer to represent them at the hearing. The good news is that if the parents do win, they will be reimbursed by the district for their legal expenses. I'm going to excuse myself for 1 second. I'm so sorry. So the due process, it's really a last step. It's a last step in the process. As you go through the whole situation, it's definitely the last step, and it can be a very lengthy process. Sometimes there'll be several hearing dates where the one side is allowed to present their information, the other side can present their information, back and forth. You can bring witnesses. It's very much like a trial is what it is, or a civil hearing. Now, what happens if I don't get everything I ask for? You go in and they say, okay, we are going to put the IEP in place, or we are going to put the 504 in place, but they don't want to acquiesce to everything you're asking for. Don't expect to get everything at one meeting. Remember, this is a process. Moving forward is an accomplishment. There will be more meetings to make more gains. And I think most of us probably know that, IEP meetings, it used to be that if you wanted to request an IEP meeting, it was a huge process. You had to, write a letter to the director of special ed, and they had to gather all the members of the IEP team together when they were all, available at one time. And sometimes just setting up an IEP meeting could take weeks. Now the law has changed on that, and you can have informal IEP meetings that are held right at the school itself, and the whole team doesn't have to be there if you're only going to be asking for minor changes. If you're asking for a change of placement or something like that, but if you're saying, we've tried this, it's not working, I think we need to have another accommodation, then I think that's what you remember that. There are opportunities in a very, swift way to get more things on that IEP if you don't agree the first time. Now we're moving on to disciplining a student who has a disability. And this topic, as I said at the beginning, is something that I deal a lot with, and I have been directly involved with hearings related to this. Disabled students are subject to the same disciplinary action as a non-disabled student, provided, there's the provided, that the student's behavior is not a manifestation of his or her qualifying disability. So in other words, if they are punishing a child for something that is related to their disability, okay, it's a manifestation of the disability, it's related to disability, then they can't discipline them for that. And as you can imagine, with kids with these disorders who have, for example, tics that teachers don't understand, they may have coprolalia, the cursing or inappropriate language tics. They may have issues related to their ADHD. There are just a lot of things that look something other than what they really are. So if in any way you can prove that it's a manifestation of that child's disability, then they cannot discipline that student as they would a non-disabled student. Now, the thing that you would have to do if you feel that they have been disciplining your child for something that is a manifestation of their disability, there are some pretty strict rules that the district has to follow. Depending on whether your child is on a 504, accommodation plan, or an IEP, the district must conduct a manifestation, what they call a manifestation determination hearing. That's a hearing to determine whether this was a manifestation of their disability. And they must do that whenever a disabled student is subject to out-of-school suspension for 10 school days in any given year. 10 school days in any given year. Now, I'll tell you, to be honest, in most of the schools I work with, they very rarely let it get to the 10 school day point. If you've got a child who is now on their 6th or 7th suspension because of behavior issues, the school district really needs to step up to the plate and say, we're not going to wait. We want to find out what's causing this, this discipline problem, and we're going to hold a manifestation hearing. They don't legally have to before the 10th day, but a lot of school districts will. And the parent can request that manifestation hearing at any time. If for example, I worked with a family last year and the school district was truly not understanding the coprolalia, and after the second or third time the child had been disciplined because of the inappropriate language, the district did agree to hold a manifestation hearing. And because it was a manifestation of the disability, then they won. And we had to decide how we're going to handle this, and part of the way we handled it is by going in and just educating everybody. I mean, everybody that comes into contact with that child, including the other students, must understand why that child can say those things and other kids cannot. And again, the purpose of that hearing is to determine if the behavior is a manifestation of the child's disability. And the law says the manifestation means that it is related to it. Not that it is a direct result of it, doesn't have to be that, strong of language, but it has to be in some way related to the child's disability. Now, if the 504 team or the IEP team concludes at the end of the hearing that the violation is a manifestation of the student's qualifying disability, the discipline process must end, and the 504 or IEP team must go back to the 504 or the IEP and make appropriate changes. So if they cannot discipline that child, and if they have, I had a girl last year I worked with, and she had already served 5 days of suspension for a particular incident. They determined that it was a manifestation of her disability, and so they had to then take all of those suspensions off her record. Unfortunately, there was nothing we could do about the fact that she had already served these days of suspension, because it had already happened. There's not a thing we could do about it. A functional behavioral, and the other thing is, if they determine that it's a manifestation of the child's disability, then a functional behavioral assessment and a behavior intervention plan must also be done. And we're going to talk about what a functional behavioral assessment and behavior intervention plan looks like in just a moment. So that's how the manifestation hearing, comes into the picture. I have to tell you, manifestation hearings are serious. When I go into an IEP meeting, I'm always willing to bend a little. We have the give and take. We go back and forth. We do a lot of educating. When it comes to a manifestation determination hearing, it's pretty serious stuff. I've worked with kids who have been, because of an incident that they consider to be, I'm trying to think of the word, not a violent episode, but something that would be threatening. I've seen them try to, put the child out of school permanently. Like, you're not allowed to come back. You will be on home instruction, now for the rest of the year, or the next 2 years, or until you finish high school. So they're pretty serious hearings. It should review, a manifestation hearing should review all relevant information. You must look over, page by page, the child's IEP. You must get teacher observations, so you need a teacher in there to talk, especially if the teacher is, one of the teachers is the one having the behavior problems with the child. You must get information from the parent, information from the student when age appropriate, and probably most importantly, information from outside experts on Tourette syndrome, so that they understand all of the ways that these disorders can manifest themselves as behavior issues when they really are not behavior issues at all. So they have to look over all kinds of information to be able to make that determination. Now, as far as the FBA, and we're going to talk about that, there's another law that the IDEA has in place, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that states that if a child's behavior is impeding that child or any other child's ability to learn, the district, the school must, and I've got that in red, an FBA must be conducted and a positive behavior intervention plan created. Now, I know this sounds like we're going to have hundreds and hundreds of kids on these things, but I wouldn't say that if a child has one incident or two incidents of, everybody's going to have a little mess up at some time in their life. But if you're getting continual notes home, your child is being disruptive, your child had to be sent to the office, we had to put your child out on the hallway for 10 minutes, your child's coming home and telling you these things, then it's pretty obvious that that child's behavior is impeding your child because they can't learn when they're not in the classroom, or other children's ability to learn. Then the district must have this IEP conducted and a behavior intervention plan created. Now, the problem with that is a lot of districts have their own functional behavioral assessment, and it may not be appropriate for kids with this set of neurological disorders. A lot of times, functional behavioral assessments are geared toward children who have emotional disturbances, whose behavior is related to an emotional issue, a social issue, as opposed to a neurological issue, and there's a huge difference in that. And so one thing that I did when I actually worked for the National Tourette Syndrome Association is we created a functional behavioral assessment workbook for students with Tourette syndrome, OCD, ADHD, and other associated neurological disorders. I know schools that have used it for kids with Asperger's, all the neurological issues, and I'm more than happy to send you a copy of that workbook. I'm going to give you at the end my email address so you can contact me for that. If you can get the district to the school to use that FBA, you're going to have a much more accurate picture of why that behavior is happening than you would with with something that a school district is using. And I'm not saying that school districts have poorly created functional behavioral assessment documents. I'm not saying that at all. But a lot of times they are geared really more toward kids whose behavior is more related to an emotional disturbance than it is a neurological disorder. And so they're not appropriate, and you don't always get the findings that you really need to get to be able to help this child. So that's another thing that I think parents need to know. So again, I want to repeat that, we have a couple of things. First of all, my feeling is if you start getting some letters home, you start getting some notes home, you start having some issues with kids, your child, has been sent to the office, your child has had an after-school detention, your child was removed from the cafeteria, they had a fight in the hallway, you're getting these little notes home. No suspensions have taken place, but clearly there are some behavioral issues. You need to go in there and say, you need to do a functional behavioral assessment. This has to be done, and I'd like you to use this form. If your child actually does start becoming a victim, so to speak, of suspensions, and if it reaches 10, then they have no choice but to do it. But I very rarely want it to go that long. I usually want to step in after 3 or 4 suspensions and say, after 3 or 4 days of suspension, and say, we really need to look at this and see how this relates to the disability. So can we have a manifestation hearing and at least get the ball rolling? Now, what is a functional behavioral assessment, and what is a positive behavior intervention plan? It's, when I was first starting teaching, I won't even tell you how many years ago, but a long time, I guess it's always been my philosophy that children will behave if they can. And so when I had a child who had a discipline problem, I always wanted to look at what it was that was creating that problem. Why was that child being disciplined? Was he bored in class and so acting up because he was bored? Was he just unable to comprehend the work? Was he having trouble sitting still? What was the issue that was creating the behavior problem? And I also found, realized early on that most kids do much better, and I can't stress that enough, with positive rewards that they're working toward than punishment. And so I think it's something that I, as an educator, have always believed in. But, as time went on, I guess the government started agreeing, and so now we have these functional behavioral assessments. Now, the functional behavioral assessment is to determine the function of the behavior of a child with these complex disorders, and to realize that it's not always what it appears. Tourette and all of its related disorders do directly affect behaviors. It is critical to ascertain how the behavior relates to the neurobehavioral disorder in order to provide an appropriate and effective behavior plan. If we can't figure out how it relates to the disorder, we're not going to be able to have an effective behavior plan, and we're going to put expectations on the child that they can't achieve, and therefore they're going to be right back in the detention room again. Now, some of you probably have heard of Dr. Ross Green from Boston. He's one of my gurus, and he had his quote that he gives that's become kind of my mantra over the years. It's your explanation of a behavior that leads directly to how you respond to it. And I'm going to give you examples as I go through this, because I think examples are the best way to demonstrate. I worked with a young girl, she was a fourth grader outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin a few years ago. And when I walked into the school, as luck would have it, they had called me in to do some consulting work. And I got into the school, and she was one of the first kids I encountered. Her locker was kind of by the main office, probably purposely. And I walked down the hall, and all of a sudden, the principal came out of her office to greet me, welcome me, and as soon as this little girl, this little fourth grader, saw the principal, she screamed out, "Kill the principal!" I immediately knew that I had found my child with Tourette's, okay? Well, think of that example. What if I didn't know that that child had Tourette, and I'm just a visitor to the school, and this kid yells this out? And she would yell that out, and then she would follow it by "kill the effing principal." So it was a very offensive statement. My explanation of that behavior, not knowing that she had Tourette, would be, oh my heavens, what a rotten little kid. What kind of problems must she have? What kind of home must she come from? And all of these things would be going through my head. But once I find out and realize that she has this neurological disorder called Tourette syndrome, and she can't help saying that, your whole explanation of that behavior changes. Then it becomes more of an issue of empathy, a reaction of empathy. Can you imagine going through life having to yell that out? How terrible for that poor child. And so many times our explanation of the behavior is completely wrong, and it leads directly to how we respond to that behavior. So, that quote has always been a real favorite of mine. Now, as I mentioned before, IDEA in 2004, when it was reauthorized, requires that an FBA be conducted and a positive behavior intervention plan be developed whenever the behavior of a student interferes with the ability of that student or other students to learn. That's the law. We can't avoid it. Now, a functional behavioral assessment is the process, and I underline process because I've gone into certain schools where they will say, we're going to do the FBA tomorrow. Well, you've got to have input from the people who are working with that child. It's a process of trying to determine why the individual is engaging in these challenging behaviors, and then how that behavior relates to the environment in that school that the child is exposed to. That's what an FBA is all about. And you can't do one overnight. It's got to take a little bit of time for a lot of things to take place. Now, unfortunately, when IDEA made this, reauthorized and made this law, it came with no funding, no training really for teachers, and limited guidelines. So schools were kind of left to their own ways of figuring out how we're going to do this. And yes, there are books and there are workbooks and there are all kinds of things out there, but there really weren't a lot of guidelines for teachers to follow. So I'm going to offer you two resources. One is called the FBA workbook, which I already mentioned, and then there's also something called the catalog of accommodations, which I'll talk about later, that you can get from me, and I'll give you my, again, email address that really are very helpful, that relate directly to these neurological disorders. Now, what is the objective of a functional behavior assessment? The objective or the purpose of this is to understand the function of a behavior, not to punish, but in order to teach and promote effective strategies, techniques, and alternatives, as well as knowing when to just consciously ignore the behavior. I'm not going to do an FBA for a tick. Ticks are not controllable. You just simply have to consciously ignore that behavior. I don't even like to call it a behavior because it really is a tick, but I see schools calling it tick behavior. I've actually, as recently as 2 years ago, worked with a particular school down south, and they had on the child's behavior chart ticks. And the first column was, 0 to 10 ticks in a class, you've got the top rating. 10 to 20, you've got the second top rating, and I was just aghast when I saw it, because that's not something we're going to put on the behavior chart. That's part of the disorder. If you didn't have tics, you wouldn't have Tourette. End of issue. Now, who contributes to this? The parents, and of course the student, I think, in some capacity can really help you. If it's a second or third grader, obviously you're not going to have them sitting around the table and going through the meeting, but I think that it's so important to, at one point, interview the student, observe the student, all kinds, get that student involved. They're the ones experiencing the difficulty. School psychologists, teachers that work with that child, OT, PT, speech, outside providers, because they can always, for example, if that child is having some sensory issues, then the OT is going to be the one to come in and explain how that affects behavior. The school counselor, paraprofessionals, if that child has a one-on-one aide, or there's an aide in the classroom that can sometimes be spending more time individually with that child than the teacher will be, that's a very important person. And I always like to include the outside people, what do we call those, the fluff. I was a French teacher, so I have a particular beef with this, because we are the ones that kind of always get left out. And I've seen so many kids where their behavior is so completely different in a music class, an art class, a phys ed class, a language class, as opposed to one of the four academic courses. Outside providers, it's so important to get the therapist, the doctor, writing notes, writing a letter to the school, even sitting in by speakerphone at the FBA meeting. School nurse can be invaluable. We so often forget the school nurse, but I've seen a lot of times where behaviors develop when medications are changed, because a child becomes more aggressive on certain neuroleptics, and so having the school nurse to explain that, it's so important. And I think probably the key person is somebody knowledgeable about Tourette. If you don't have somebody knowledgeable about Tourette syndrome plus with all the associated disorders, you're not going to get the answers that you want. So that's who needs to contribute to the FBA. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole workbook with you that was created, but just to show you how it works and give you some examples of how I've implemented this myself, I think will help you understand why this is such an invaluable part of this whole process. The workbook explains lots and lots about Tourette and some of the associated disorders and how they affect kids and how they affect behaviors. But then there are, within that document, there's one sheet front and back that we ask in an elementary school at minimum of 3 teachers to fill out that are working with that child. In a middle or high school, minimum of 5 teachers. Now, obviously, the more people that can fill it out, the better results we're going to have, because we're looking for data. We're looking for clues, what's triggering this. And this is what that first sheet looks like. Okay, this is what you're going to give to, I give it to every teacher, the counselor, everybody working with that child, sometimes even the cafeteria monitor. Let them get in it, because that's sometimes where they have their problems. So we give that to them, and we ask them, I always say, don't fill this out as soon as you get it in your hand. Keep it on your desk for a while and think about it, because I'm asking you some questions that you may not even have thought about before I gave you this form. So we got the general information. Then we want to know, what are the behaviors observed. Now, for a couple of reasons, I made a lot of this a checklist. The reason is, as a teacher, I much prefer checklists. They're easier to fill out. But more importantly, I know what the behaviors are. I've worked with kids with Tourette for enough years that everybody seems to have similar types of behaviors in similar circumstances. So you ask them to think about it, and let's figure out, what is the behavior that's impeding learning? Is that child off task? Are they out of their seat frequently? Are they talking out in class? Are they refusing to do their work? Are they exhibiting aggressive behaviors? Are they disrespectful? Are they being disinhibited, socially inappropriate with peers and other? And then I asked them to be specific about the behavior. What does it look like? Okay, what's happening? So again, you have to think about this for a couple of days. The next question I ask is, how often does the behavior occur? Then I want to know, where does it occur? These are all clues, okay? For example, is it happening in a particular class? And I'll give you an example in a second of how that really played out in a functional behavioral assessment I did a few years ago. Is it in the hallway? Is it in the cafeteria? Is it on the school bus? Other. And I think just as importantly, where does the behavior not occur? If it's not occurring in a particular environment, but it is occurring in the other, there's a reason for that. Now, the example I want to give you was a boy I went in and observed. I was supposed to spend the morning, and the first class I observed, he was a second grader, was reading, and he was an absolutely perfectly behaved child. Now, I have to tell you that the teacher in advance had told me that what was happening is he was starting to become quite oppositional and just simply refusing to do his work. So those are the kind of things that I was looking for, because that's what the teacher had told me. So again, the first class I was reading, he was, very well behaved, did a great job, raised his hand, read. I mean, he had some tics and he was a little antsy, but nothing that he would consider a behavior problem. Then he went to music class and he was just delightful. The teacher was great with him, and because she saw that he was a little hyper, she had him passing out the music books and kept him occupied, and he loves music, so again, very well behaved. Then we went to phys ed, and phys ed, because he had a lot of activity, he was, very well behaved in there. And then after that third class, I was thinking the teacher was making this up. I have not seen one tiny, slight example of oppositionality. And I almost went home, then I decided to kind of stick it out one more class, and we went back to the regular classroom after phys ed. And as the kids were walking in, the teacher said to them, okay, remember now we're going to our writing tables to finish our journal entries from yesterday. And so I went over to take my place at the teacher's desk where I was doing the observation, and I looked up and the teacher was pointing down to where this child had gone. And he was actually at his desk up in the front of the room underneath the desk. And I kind of looked down at him and I said, Andrew, aren't you supposed to be at your, at your reading table? And at your writing table to work on your journal? He goes, I don't write. And I'm not coming out of here. You can't make me. Nobody can make me come out from here. I'm not coming out. Now, all of a sudden, it looks like a severe emotional problem, a Jekyll and Hyde personality. This perfectly delightful kid who's gone through 3 classes, being wonderful, all of a sudden is, hiding under his desk and refusing to come out. But he gave me the answer when he said, I don't write. And I started looking through some of the things on his desk, and he clearly had a serious issue with dysgraphia, handwriting disability. He couldn't read a thing. He didn't space between words. And he had also another thing that was really interfering. He had a lot of tics where he twisted and turned his fingers, lapping one finger over the other. So holding a pencil was particularly problematic. And, it was interesting because I immediately figured it out. I mean, you would have just thought this kid has got a serious emotional problem and he's just hiding under his desk all of a sudden for absolutely no apparent reason. But he didn't do that any other time than when he had to pick up a pencil or a pen and start writing something. So, it just kind of led us to what the problem is and what we needed to do about it. When does the behavior most frequently occur? And this is the thing you have to really think about for a while as an educator. Is it during completion of written work? With that child, there it was the only time. Transition times. A lot of kids with especially OCD have a really difficult time with transitioning from one activity to another. Was it during a testing situation, in an unstructured environment, when tics were exacerbated, in noisy environments? Was it when they were trying to interact with peers? Because, again, a lot of our kids are socially immature and they don't pick up on social cues, so it doesn't happen until they have to do a little group work. During a specific task, reading, math, writing on the board, using a pen or pencil. When directions are being given, a lot of kids, with these disorders have what we call auditory processing difficulties, and they process especially oral information, but it can also be written information. They process it much more slowly and many times differently than what a lot of other kids do. And, if you give a child a direction that says, take out your book, turn to page 5 or number 3C, and that, even if you repeat it a couple times, that child has already lost you on take out your book, because it takes them a while to process all that in their brain, and you've moved on to 2 more directions by then. And the immediate reaction of the child is going to be to throw their book on the floor and say, this is stupid, because to them it is stupid. So, all of these are clues to what's happening. Now, then we are asked to draw some conclusions. But in order to do that, we're not just going to say, so many times when I don't give them this checklist, the conclusion that I get from a lot of people working with these kids is they're doing it for attention. Because that's, what else could it be? Why else would a child behave this way? But once you've checked off all these things on your little chart, pages 2, 3, and 4, numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5, then you might be able to draw some better conclusions as to why that child is behaving that way. If you checked off that this only happens when they are having you do something written, then I think you better check off the box that says difficulty with written work, because that's where it's happening. Is it transitioning, interfering tics, difficulty remaining seated, processing directions? You see how this is a step-by-step process of looking at the behavior, where does it happen, where it doesn't happen, and kind of figuring out which part, what's causing it, what's happening to make that child behave that way. And I think, again, I say it's also very important to consider medication side effects and or changes in medications when evaluating behaviors. Frequent communication with the school nurse and the parents is crucial, because you need to find out if there's been a medication change, has the total medication change, or has just been increased, decreased, whatever, so you can see if some of that is related. That's why that school nurse is such an important person. Now, once they have filled that out, we like to select someone in that school who is going to take all of these forms that have been filled out by the individual people, teachers, teacher aides, outside providers, and summarize them to kind of see if they all bundle in a certain area. That person can be the regular classroom teacher. It can be a special education teacher working with that child. It could be the school psychologist. It could be the school nurse. It could be the school counselor. The principal. It could be a lot of different people. It doesn't make any difference, but someone needs to summarize. And the summary sheet is intended to be a summary of all the information from all of the people who completed the worksheets as the final step in focusing on which are the specific behaviors that we need to be working on and why they're happening when we're writing the behavior plan. The summary sheet is almost identical to the functional behavioral assessment sheet that the teachers filled out. General information, what are the behaviors that are being observed, which ones are impeding learning. I always tell teachers, try not to do more than 2 or 3 behaviors. It's overwhelming. If I go in and see a behavior chart that has 10 behaviors on it, I mean, as a teacher, I'd have trouble keeping track of those behaviors to be evaluating that child on a daily basis, but the poor child is lost. I mean, you can accomplish a lot with one behavior. One of the ones I use a lot when I'm working with elementary kids is good hands, good feet. Boy, does that take in a lot of territory. And again, how often does the behavior occur? Where does it occur? Where does the behavior not occur? When does the behavior most frequently occur? From 2, 3, 4, and 5, which of the following conclusions might you draw as possible reasons? And there are our conclusions again. You'll see them kind of focusing in one area. I'll see a thing come back, a sheet come back from a teacher, and there'll be 4 teachers who have checked off difficulty with written work or difficulty remaining seated. So you start really seeing that this is a problem in a lot of different places, so we've got to look at that. Then we want to look at the strategies and the supports that need to be implemented. And again, this follows. It just takes you right through the whole process. If you've checked off that that child is only misbehaving when he has written work to do, then you better start providing some writing supports. Now, what's interesting about this workbook is after this particular section, there is a section of several pages, and it takes each one of these categories, writing supports, testing modifications, assistance with transition, and it gives you a list of possible accommodations. Writing supports. If it's a young child, like with this boy that I talked about earlier who was hiding under his desk, he was a 2nd grader. He wasn't computer, literate at that time. He couldn't type. So we had to look at a scribe to help him with his written work because of the tics and the dysgraphia that was interfering. We got some occupational therapy in place to help him kind of strengthen some of that. As he moved on, he got more and more into technology, and he used a little kind of a portable word processor called an AlphaSmart, which he used for a while. Then they brought him up to a laptop computer, and now this kid has his own iPad, which is his life. I mean, it goes everywhere with him, and he does everything on the iPad, and he has voice-activated software, which is a free app on iPods and iPads, so he doesn't even write anymore at all. He just dictates into this iPad. His homework is typed up as he speaks, and then he, either prints it out from that or emails it to himself or prints it out. Or sometimes just emails it to the teacher so it doesn't get lost from home to school, which happens a lot with our kids. So again, you look at every one of these are all kinds of things that, if that seems to be the problem, here are the solutions. Then we want to look at what positive interventions can be implemented by the staff, and I've already talked about some of these, and make sure that the accompanying accommodation sheet is with that. And then we come to the part where we actually put together the positive behavior intervention plan. To me, this is sometimes the tricky part. I go in, and if I spend a few hours with the child, and I can also chat with the teachers, have them fill out the form, I can fairly quickly figure out what the issue is. Because is it an issue with kids who are hypersensitive to certain sounds, and a lot of our kids who have sensory issues, their problems are going to be very, very heightened in areas where they're on sensory overload. Cafeteria, hallway, school bus, all kinds of places in the environment where there's just a lot of chaotic noise. The fluorescent lights may be too bright. They may be overheated. This is what causes, they get on overload, and it causes a behavior problem. And so we have to think not only of the behavior, the reward that we want to put in place for them, but also how can we change their environment. So again, the intervention plan, we're going to start out with some general information about the child, and then we're going to list the behaviors that are targeted. Like with this boy, we listed, refusing to do his work and hiding under his desk. Those were essentially his two behaviors. I mean, he was 7, so there wasn't a lot to work with here. Then we want to look at what are the behavior supports that we need to implement. And with this child, we needed to put in place, a scribe. He had to have a scribe. We had some other things that we worked on also, but basically we had to find a way for him to get his written work done because he just simply couldn't write. You also want to look at possible environmental changes. For example, if a child is, always getting into trouble in the hallway, I'll go down to the office and I'll say, can I look at the behavior record? And if I look at the behavior record and that child has, 16 detentions and every one of them is for hallway or cafeteria behavior, it's like, I guess we didn't look at this too carefully because it's obviously that he needs some environmental modifications. And one of the things that I often recommend is that the child just leave the classroom 3 minutes before everybody else so they're not in the hallway with all the chaos and they're not on sensory overload. But I really am always cognizant of the fact that I don't want these kids to look like they're being punished for something that they don't have any control over. It's not their fault they have sensory issues. So when I put that leave class early on an IEP or a 504 plan, I'll always accompany it by, and they can have a 1 or 2 other students go with them. Because let's face it, especially middle and high school, when they are changing classes frequently, hallway time is social time for them, and they deserve that time. And so you can, if you let somebody go with them, then they have the time to socialize in a much calmer environment so they don't miss out on that. One little boy said to me, I don't think I have any friends that will want to leave early with me. And I looked at him and I said, honey, you're going to ask the class for someone to volunteer to leave 3 minutes early. Believe me, you'll have volunteers. Don't worry. Don't worry about it. That's going to happen. Okay, then we're going to look at one of the hardest parts, and those are the positive rewards. What can we offer to that child if they keep things, we set that behavior program up and they adhere to it? I guess over the years, many of us think of rewards as, monetary. It has to be something monetary, but believe me, I have come up with the most creative rewards you can imagine. I used to actually, I've had kids that I've worked with, my own students included, who didn't want the same reward all the time. So I had a reward jar on my desk. And if they got their reward, they could pick something from the reward jar. And it could be, they get out of a homework assignment. It could be they get to go down to the computer room the last, 20 minutes during their study hall and play a computer game with a friend. It could be, going down and shooting some basketball hoops. Sometimes we'll coordinate it with home so that if the child will earn a coupon with a certain amount of time that they can do something at home they particularly enjoy doing. The one kid I was working with last year, his reward was a 15-minute coupon. He could earn a 15-minute coupon every day for playing the Xbox at home. And that's the only time he could play the Xbox is if he had coupons for it. So, you can have all kinds of rewards. I think the most important thing to remember with these rewards, if it's not something that the child wants, they aren't going to work for it. It's not going to work. I can come up with the most fantastic award. You can pick a candy out of the candy jar, you can do such and such, but if they don't care about it, it's useless. They're not going to work for it. I often tell a story that happened probably going back about 15 years now, before FBAs were even heard of. It was a young man I worked with whose name was Sam, and Sam was in my homeroom, and Sam had a very difficult home life. He had, a mother in a psychiatric hospital, dad was in jail, being raised by a very elderly aunt and uncle, and he had Tourette, he had ADHD, he had OCD, he had everything. And one of the things that the principal came to me one day and said, Sue, Sam is late for school every day. And I said, I've noticed. He was in my homeroom, so I was very aware of that. And he said, you're very creative. Think of a way to get him here on time. He's up to his 19th detention for being late for school, and obviously that's not working. I think I would have figured that out after maybe 2 or 3. I wouldn't have waited for 19. So, I'm thinking to myself, do I actually have to go pick this child up? What do I have to do? But, knowing, having dealt with these kind of things over the years, I remember calling Sam up to my class, up to my desk after homeroom one day, and I thought, I've got to figure out why he's late. If I can't figure out why he's late, how can I help the problem? So I asked him why he was late every day, and he gave me the perfect explanation. He said, well, you know where I live, and he named the street, and I knew it was literally 6 or 7 minutes from school. And he said, I leave home every day at 8:30. My school didn't start till 9. And I'm thinking 6 or 7 minutes, and you've got a half hour. Why are you coming in 10 minutes late? He said, but what I do is every day I go to the donut shop on the corner, and I buy 2 donuts and hot chocolate. And he said, I know I should probably bring my donuts and hot chocolate to homeroom and eat them there, but I don't. Instead, I take them to this little park, the park, and I knew the park. And I sit down, and I have my hot chocolate and donuts. I listen to my music. Sometimes I feed some of my donuts to the pigeons. It was basically just getting lost. He's severely ADHD, just getting kind of lost in that, where he was and what he was supposed to be doing, all ADHD stuff. And he said, I'll suddenly look at my watch, and it's 9 o'clock, and I know I'm going to be late. So I said to him, what reward can I offer you for getting to school on time? What would help you? And I gave him some examples, and he asked me if he could wait till the next day, so I said yes. So he came in the next day, late of course, and came up to my desk and said, I've decided what I want as my reward if I come to school on time. And I said, now remember, it has to be reasonable. He goes, oh yeah, it's reasonable. And he said, what I would like to do is instead of coming in the front door of the school like everybody else does, I want to come around to the back of the building where your classroom is, and I want to climb in the window. And of course, I'm looking at him like, okay, the principal said do whatever you can. I know this is a little unusual, but I agreed to it. Now, I was on the first floor, so we weren't involving, ladders or anything like that. It was a big escape window that I had in my classroom, so it was easy to get in and out. Never really thinking about why he might ask for such a ridiculous thing. So we put it in place, and the next day at 10 minutes to 9, I was sitting at my desk, and I hear knock on my classroom window, and there's Sam. The next day, 10 of 9, there's Sam again with his donuts and hot chocolate. And that was honestly the last time Sam was ever late for school. And I asked him one day, why did you pick that? I could have given you a homework pass. I could have given you candy from the candy jar. I went all through a list of all the things I could have given him. Why did you ever pick coming in the window of my classroom? And he looked at me and he said, you know what, Ms. Connors, everybody here knows I'm not a cool kid. I'm not cool. Coming in the window, that's cool. And I'll never forget that, because truly, long before functional behavioral assessments existed, that was a functional behavioral assessment with a positive intervention plan. It can be as simple as that. It doesn't have to be pages and days and whatever. Now, I think one of the most important things with a behavior plan is the positive intervention plan is the communication plan. We often forget to give it to certain people. We don't coordinate it. Who's going to coordinate it? Who's the person in that building who's going to coordinate that plan that child reports to? What is the date of the next meeting? These things don't last for life. Sometimes things change. Has every teacher and staff member working with that student received and signed it? If one teacher does not follow that plan, it falls apart. That's all it takes is one teacher. Have the student and the parents been informed of the strategies so they know what they're entitled to get as strategies? And again, be sure to include the accommodation sheet. A good FBA involves detective work. When, where, when not, where not, who's present, environmental clues. I've worked with kids who when they get overheated, their tics get worse, the behavior gets worse, and that could happen in a phys ed class. It could happen in the school cafeteria. So we put in place as 5 minutes before the end of that class or 5 minutes before the end of lunch, they go to the school nurse and have an ice pack put on their neck to cool their body temperature down. You know, looking for clues, looking for triggers. And the only reason to conduct an FBA is to produce a positive behavior intervention plan. Otherwise, there's no sense in putting it together. My platinum rule has always been, what can we do for the child prior to the behavior instead of what can we do to the child after the behavior. We're quick to punish, but if we can help them ahead of time, we won't have to worry about that because the behavior won't occur. And it's a cooperative effort, be willing to negotiate, be assertive, not aggressive, all the things that you have to think about when you're going into a school to work on any kind of issues. For those of you who were on the webinar last week, you saw this list of resources that I have you can contact me for. Getting help in school, where do I begin? The difference between an IEP and a 504 plan. And the two big ones that I talked about today, the catalog of accommodations and the functional behavioral assessment workbook, are very important. All you have to do is send me an email, and I'll give you my email address in a second, and I'm more than happy to send those as an attachment. I mentioned also last week, if you have an issue with the school being in compliance, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I dealt with it last week. They're not following the proper procedures. They're not having the right people at the IEP meetings. You need to know that there is a quality assurance office in every state ed department, and they have compliance officers for all school districts in that state. And you can call that quality assurance office and ask for the compliance officer for your district, your school, and contact them. And once a compliance officer calls the school reporting that there's been a complaint, they have to get into compliance or they lose their state aid, which no school wants to do. So it's a if you need to know how to contact that person, also email me. One of the things I want to mention, and this is the book that was mentioned at the beginning that I just published, this functional behavioral assessment is also in the book. And one of the other things that's in that book is pages and pages and pages of accommodations, but also I created a functional behavioral assessment work for home use, because we know that behaviors don't always just happen in school. Kids come home and have their meltdowns, and why is this happening, and how can we change things? So in the book there is a functional behavioral assessment workbook and assistance to put together a behavior plan for home as well as school. We're running out of time, so I'm going to have to wind this up by giving you, there's the email address, that's my chapter website, but my email address, connors@roadrunner.com. If you want any of the materials that I listed, or how to contact your quality assurance officer, whatever, just send me a quick email and I'll get back to you. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Sue. Kind of cranking it up there towards the end.
Yeah, I was.
All right, have a bunch of questions, and some of them, there are some really good questions here. So I'm going to get right into them, okay? This I'm going to paraphrase a little bit because it was a little lengthy, but this individual wants clarification on something. Her understanding was that the law says the independent evaluation is covered only if the public school's evaluation was inadequate, not merely if the parent disagrees.
No,
so could you just clarify that a little bit, because there's a misunderstanding there.
Yeah, if you don't agree with it, that's all you have to say is we don't agree with this evaluation. That's all you have to say. It doesn't have to be that it was inadequate. It's just that you don't agree with it, because you're seeing a lot of things that were not picked up. And a lot of it could be that it was an inadequate evaluation, because let's face it, school districts are restricted by the evaluation tools that the district purchases. And usually it's the standardized school psychologist battery of tests. Whereas if your child has significant neurological issues, a neuropsychological evaluation is going to be much more helpful and much more adequate. So it could be that. But all you have to do is say, I disagree with the findings, and that's it.
Okay. All right. Thanks for clarifying that. Question about how you tease out what is regular discipline issue instead of a Tourette or an ADA related, how can you give a couple examples of that?
Well, that's the question of the year. It's a difficult one, and I think, I'm not saying that a child with Tourette will never have a behavior issue that's not related to the disorder, because that does happen. Kids are kids. But I think, once you do the FBA, it really helps you tease that out. if you can figure out what it is that's creating that behavior and how it relates to the disorder, and then put some strategies in place, whether it be at home or school, you will succeed in, eradicating that behavior.
Mm. So if they were to, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, the other thing is that, when you use this, sometimes by putting the positive rewards in place, it's like an incentive for them to be able to improve that behavior. And a lot of times it's teaching them strategies, like, I know that I'm not going to get my reward if I do such and such, but what strategy can I use so that I don't do such and such? And sometimes simply saying, well, here's a strategy. You could take a walk. You could go ride your bike around the block, at home. You could take a walk down the hall and use your little, laminated special pass so that you won't get out of control in this situation. So I think it's giving them strategies to be able to help themselves, not get into that behavior issue. And if they don't, if they really want that reward, they will work for it by using those strategies.
Yeah. Could you use that home functional behavior assessment in that case to kind of work through some of that at home?
Absolutely, and I listed, like, the behaviors that you would see in school sometimes are similar to the ones you see at home, but sometimes they can be very different. And a lot of times I'll say to parents, it's impossible for me to take my child out to dinner on a Friday night because restaurants are crowded and we always have a meltdown. We always have a scene in the restaurant. Well, that's because it is Friday night and restaurants are crowded on Friday night. So, so maybe your environmental change needs to be, we need to order pizza on Friday night and have it in the living room. And then on Tuesday night, when the restaurants aren't as crowded, we'll go out for dinner. And sometimes, simple as that, and you can end the behaviors. And not only that, you're basically teaching the child that this is how my life has got to be. I need to know at an early age that I told one boy recently, you don't belong in the mosh pit of a concert. Because you can't handle that environment. You couldn't handle the assembly at school. How are you going to handle that?
Handle the concert, yeah.
Exactly.
All right. So, question about the functional behavior assessment. So, if this child has been suspended, but for less than 10 days,
right,
and there is a continuous threatening to be suspended, so the parents have made requests for the FBA,
right,
but it's being ignored. So what kind of a recourse there? What is a parent to do in that situation?
Well, for the manifestation hearing, the school has a right to not conduct it unless they've been suspended 10 days within that school year.
Mm-hmm.
Most schools won't wait that long. You can request it, but they do have the right to deny that, and I've seen it happen. However, with the FBA, if they've had any behavioral issues that have interfered with their ability to access their education or another child's ability to access their education, they have to do a functional behavioral assessment. You don't have to have been suspended. You just got, a few notes home, maybe a couple detentions. If you've got behavior issues that are interfering with their ability or someone else's ability to access their education, they have to do the FBA. Manifestation hearing they don't have to do unless it's 10 days suspension.
Okay. So is there a cost to the school to do that, and maybe that's why they don't want to do it?
Well, I think the manifestation hearing, there probably is a cost because it's, they have to bring an outside, hearing officer, and they have to, pull people from their jobs and whatever. I'm not saying it's a great cost. I'm saying it's not like hiring a lawyer to come in, that type of thing.
Okay. But there is some...
the 10 days seems to me extraordinarily long, and most districts don't want to wait that long. But that's...
And that's 10 days not simultaneously, correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Now, if they had a 10-day suspension, then you're done right there.
Yeah.
You got it automatically.
Okay.
So.
All right. So another one. Can we, as a parent, can we ask the school what their FBA is for kids with Tourette to see what they use and whether proposing to use the one similar to what you've developed?
Yeah, you can ask, and many times it's the same FBA for everybody, which is really not good because, like I said before, there's a huge difference. One of the reasons you can use for using this one as opposed to using, and you can give the booklet to them, as opposed to using the one they've created, is that your child has a classification of other health impaired, and the health impairment, it's almost like a child with diabetes. When the blood sugar gets low, they tend to get grumpy and, kind of oppositional. Well, it's not because of an emotional problem, it's because of that issue. So you wouldn't use the same strategies on that child. So you can use the fact that they're other health impaired, and therefore this one is much more appropriate to use. I mean, having said that, the district can refuse to use anything but the one they have. They can do that.
Okay.
So.
But the chances of it being appropriate to what goes on for a particular kid with Tourette is
exactly
slim.
Exactly.
Yeah. Another question about the 10-day suspension. Does it make a difference whether it's in school or out of school or anything like that?
No, it's either in school or out of school. And I think I, on my slide, put out of school, but it can be either, because if they're in school suspension, they're still missing class. So.
Okay. All right. We are running a little over. Another quick question that I think is an easy one. The ADA laws, how do those translate for families who have children in private school?
Well, it's kind of an interesting issue, and if anybody wants, I have a whole brochure on, private schools. They have changed the laws on that significantly in the last few years. It would take me a long time to go through them all, which I know we don't have time for now, but I'm happy to send the brochure to anybody who wants it. The private schools, if they are receiving any federal assistance whatsoever, and it's rare that they're not receiving some federal assistance, whether it be through the school district buses bringing them in, bringing the kids to the private schools, they're tax exempt, and that's federal money. There are a lot of different ways of showing that you're getting some sort of a federal benefit, then they do have to abide by the same rules as everybody else does. But I have a brochure that really speaks very clearly about all the things that, private schools have to do. The only thing they really don't have to do is keep your child if they feel they don't have the right program for them. That does happen.
That's true. I've known of families that, come out of private school and into public to get the services that they need for their kid.
Yeah, and you don't really have to do that anymore. The laws have changed. I work with a lot of kids in private schools, private parochial schools, all kinds of things, and they have IEPs, they have 504 plans, and they have to implement them.
Okay. All right. One more, and then we're going to wrap it up. Just talk a little bit about discipline, because we touched on that, but we've spent a lot of time on, the IEP stuff, the education piece. But in the discipline category, just talk a little bit about the necessity of the consistency in discipline between parents and extended family, and how confusing and disruptive it can be for the kid when that doesn't happen.
Yeah. It is very true, and that's why one of my ideal situations, it doesn't always work depending on the home situation, but one of my ideal situations is where you can coordinate the rewards between home and school, like the child who was earning coupons to do his Xbox at home. And every day there was an email sent home, and the mother had, and he had his little coupons, and unless he brought home his coupons, he couldn't play in the Xbox. So it was very consistent expectations for that child. And the mother decided that she was going to use the same technique at home with some of the behaviors that she was seeing at home, so he could earn extra coupons. And so, that consistency between home and school is critical. But having said that, it doesn't always work, because sometimes parents, with their jobs, they're busy, they're not home, there are babysitters, grandma comes in, all kinds of things. But it is a really important part of it. And that's why I've created the home behavior assessment, because I think it'll help parents see why the child is behaving the way they're behaving in certain situations. A lot of times I tell parents, if the child is coming home and melting down the minute they get in that door, it's probably because they're not being properly accommodated at school, and they're coming home with such a level of frustration that they're just letting it all out as soon as they walk in that door. So, the home and school communication is critical. It really is.
Okay. Well, Sue, we've gone well over. I'm going
That's all
to
right.
end it here. Thank you very much. Again, another great presentation. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining our webinar on Education Rights Part 2, Denial of Services and Discipline Issues. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The discussion board is open now and is available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any additional questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to our website shortly. Our next presentation, Generation Text, Raising Well-Adjusted Kids in an Age of Instant Everything, will be presented by Dr. Michael Ossett and is scheduled for September 19th, 2012. Thank you. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Ms. Connors, for your presentation, and thank you, everyone, for attending. Good night.